From the WATE.com Digital Center, answering your legal questions, this is Ask Isaacs. Now, here's Lori Tucker and attorney Greg Isaacs.
Hi everyone, good Wednesday afternoon to you. I'm Lori Tucker along with our legal analyst Greg Isaacs here to talk about a case that has gotten a lot of talk and continues to get reaction around the country and especially in the Memphis community. And we're talking about the Tyre Nichols case. Greg, you came in to talk about the fact that despite what some call graphic footage and federal convictions, although they're on different charges, 3 former Memphis police officers were acquitted in Nichols' death on the state level, raising questions about justice reform. So you're going to join us now to talk about the fact that a lot of people were stunned at these not guilty verdicts, especially after you had 2 other former officers who pleaded guilty and are serving time.
This case, literally, not to sound like a cliche, shocked the nation. You know, I'll never forget, I had a colleague from the University of Memphis Law School told me that they were closing school early at the University of Memphis because they were going to release a very graphic, salacious video that evening. I was in New York, and Lori, I saw that video being released, and it was graphic, it was horrific, and shocking.
We're going to get to the background of this case. We're going to take you through every step from the time that Tyre Nichols was pulled over until he was beaten. But in the meantime, let's take a look at what happened after those not guilty verdicts.
Not guilty.
A jury had the final say on a case that drew local and national headlines, the deadly police beating of 29-year-old Tyre Nichols in Memphis. Jurors found all 3 former police officers not guilty of the state charges against them. Thaddeus Johnson, a former Memphis police commander, tells WREG he was shocked over Wednesday's verdict.
I saw the verdict and I was completely taken aback. I by no means expected for them to be found guilty of second-degree murder, but perhaps facilitation, perhaps official misconduct. I was expecting for them to get some charges, and if not, some lesser charges versus second degree.
Although the verdict was surprising, Johnson says the defense team successfully made arguments that left jurors with room for reasonable doubt. The former officers' use of force during their interaction with Nichols was brought up at trial. Some of the experts who took the stand justified the former officers' actions that night. However, Johnson disagrees.
I don't know what training that was. It's not the training that I received at the academy. It's not how I trained other officers. And I trained the officers in defensive tactics. I trained the officers in use of force and firearms and deadly force.
Despite the disappointment over the verdict, Johnson says it's important for the community and city leaders to repair their relationship.
We have to get into the communities and have to do more than just talk. We have to roll our sleeves up and walk these streets with them and have their lived experiences.
All right, that's what happened just a few days ago when those not guilty verdicts were returned. But Greg, let's go back to the night that Nichols was pulled from his car. He was pulled over for accused of reckless driving. He's pulled from his car. Let's take it from there.
In January 2023, 29-year-old Tyre Nichols was pulled over for a routine traffic stop by members of the Scorpion Squad. What was the Scorpion Squad? A special detail in Memphis that was designed to have high police saturation and use very aggressive tactics in a way to try to combat the crime rate, which had risen in particular areas of Shelby County. But it was interesting. So he gets pulled over for a minor misdemeanor offense. Then he is tased, he is pepper sprayed, and manages to run away. And that's where the facts and the law collide in this case.
At that point, the chase is on, and this is when we start talking about deadly force and when you can legally use that as a police officer.
Right. So here is the backdrop of the charges that these officers, 5 officers, were acquitted. And the charges were, Lori, very serious felonies under Tennessee law: second-degree murder, aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping, official misconduct, official oppression. And the defense team walked the board on all of them, not guilties. But Once someone flees, the law in Tennessee changed when a case actually from East Tennessee went to the Supreme Court, and officers can only use reasonable force when someone is a fleeing felon or fleeing arrest.
Whether they're armed or not.
Whether they're armed or not. But if you have, here's the parameters for deadly force. If you have a reasonable, and everything is prefaced by a reasonable belief, and those words came down from the Supreme Court on a Tennessee case, a reasonable belief that the individual has committed a felony involving serious bodily injury or grievous sexual assault, or that they pose a risk of death to the officer's serious bodily injury or to the general public, you can use deadly force under two scenarios. One, you identify yourself as a police officer, and second, you indicate that you intend to use deadly force if that individual does not stop.
Do we know that they did that in this case?
You know, we don't, but this was a little different because if you look at the body cam footage that goes on for it seems like an eternity, you know, they did catch him. He was a fleeing suspect. It was unclear to me whether he was a felon or not in their opinion. But, you know, the force happened after he was apprehended because, you know, he had already been tased. He had already been beaten before he escaped. Then, once he is subdued, the officers repeatedly kick him, repeatedly pepper spray him, repeatedly baton him as he's handcuffed and laying there. And then after those injuries that seemingly went on forever because you have a series of body cams and officers are talking, apparently it appears they're trying to concoct a narrative on what happened or will you support me? A lot we cannot quote. But he was denied medical attention for 25 minutes before he was taken
from even a firefighter, apparently.
Yeah, and there were EMTs on the scene as he lay there, and he was visibly in medical distress, medical peril.
He was calling for his mother. He kept saying, "Mom, Mom."
Almost a mile away from his house where he tried to go.
He died 3 days after.
But that's no excuse. You know, one thing, the trial, as it unfolded, we find out that he did have stolen credit cards in his trunk. I think that's a non sequitur in this case because obviously the police officers had no idea that he had stolen credit cards in his trunk. But here's the and there's also the state case isn't the beginning and the end. There was also a federal trial.
Those charges were lesser.
So you have 5 officers. You have Bean, you have Haley, you have Martin, you have Mills, and you have Smith. Martin and Mills cooperated. They flipped, as you say. So here's the interesting thing. You're the defense lawyer. You assess the evidence in this case. You decide that it's in your client's best interest to plead guilty. Well, they pled guilty in the federal case, cooperated in this case. The other 3 co-defendants in the federal case got convicted of much lesser crimes than they were charged with. Fast forward to last week, not guilty on each and every count of the indictment for Bean, for Haley, for Smith. So if you're the other 2 officers that cooperated, and I think Martin is facing almost 40 years, you know, you may be scratching your head and saying, you know, did I make the right decision?
Did my attorney make the right decision for
me? Well, we're not going to go there because we don't know what the evidence is. But
true.
But you know,
but they do get a little bit of time. Sentencing points, right?
They will get, in federal court, it's called a 5K motion for downward departure, which means that they factor in your cooperation to your sentence. And also when you enter a plea, you have the luxury and the time to try to craft an agreement that's more beneficial to your client with the federal sentencing guidelines, which are very complex. But, you know, the corollary with this case, and it's interesting that every time, no matter if someone is convicted in a high-profile case, you have people that want to criticize the jury and say the system is broken because this poor individual had a jury of a different ethnic composition, and they did not
And
receive a
that's
fair trial.
certainly the case in
And
this.
well, in this case, you have a jury that was in a different ethnic composition, but they listened to the proof, they listened to expert testimony, and they acquitted all three defendants of 5 serious felonies.
Yes.
And now we're saying that somehow that it's broken or it's flawed. I think the system works. And what we want to do is, if it's a result that the royal we, the media, or a certain segment of society doesn't like, we immediately want to reform something. We immediately want to criticize the jury. But, you know, again, this was not an intentional killing. This was, to me, from the outside in, what it looked like was a very severe degree of excessive force. You know, one of the individuals that pled, Martin, the defense had the luxury of pointing the finger time and time again at Martin because he was one of the primary aggressors. But it is amazing throughout our history when you see a Rodney King verdict, when you see the famous "I can't breathe," which led to a conviction, and you see this case. But remember, trials are extraordinarily complex. And, you know, the federal case, you're not allowed to have cameras in the courtroom, so we really didn't have a real-time view of what went on. But, you know, in this case, everyone's judgment was predicated on those body cams. And let me tell you, body cams are powerful. Smartphones are powerful, but that's not the beginning and the end of the proof that the jury saw in this case.
You know, I've got to ask you about the 2 others who are sitting in prison right now. Do they have a chance to appeal? Do they have? Would this help any appeals? The fact that the others who are involved in this?
Buyer's remorse is typically not. The question is, the legal touchstone is, did you make a knowing, intelligent, voluntary decision? They had excellent lawyers. I know one very well, and I think got very detailed advice. This just goes to show you sometimes, you know, as a Texas trial lawyer friend of mine says, there ain't a horse that can't be rode or a cowboy that can't be throwed. And I mean, you know, you never know till you're in there.
Yeah.
An interesting development. We always talk about change of venue in these cases.
Hold that thought. We have to go to break.
Hold it.
You don't want to miss this. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Glad you're with us today. We are talking about the Tyre Nichols case. And Greg, we left people hanging with a thought that you wanted to share. So let's pick right back up.
We talk about, you know, why in a high-profile case, why didn't they ask for a change of venue? Why don't they get a change of venue? In this case, the defense asked for a change of venue. That motion was granted, and this was a jury veneer from Hamilton County,
Chattanooga.
which is Chattanooga, up the road a ways, as we say in East Tennessee. But, you know, again, I think that underscores the fact, you know, what both sides want in a case, whether it's a high-profile case, any case, when we're trying to take a citizen's freedom, you're trying to seek justice for the people of the state of Tennessee, is you want a jury that is fair and impartial. And, you know, I think taking the step of, and most people think, like the old days, you move the circus to a different town. No, that's not the way it is. What you do is you pick a jury from a different location, and then they suddenly realize that, oops, I am now sequestered on a bus and I'm headed to Memphis. But I think that's a good sign.
But the hope is they haven't heard of it, thereby
you
have
minimize,
more impartiality.
you know, the publicity. You don't have media coverage that would permeate the veneer and potential prejudice as you would in Shelby County and Memphis. So, you know, the system did everything it could to protect this case. And I think it also goes to show that when you have a case of tremendous prejudicial publicity, and you've got a parallel civil case that's ongoing,
Right.
so you've got a lot of chatter on both sides of the
You do
fence.
have a lot of chatter, and I want to go back to, it's just hard for people to wrap their minds around the fact that you have this video that is so outrageous. You see these officers just waylaying on this guy. He's calling for his mother. He's not armed. And they're wondering, how on earth could a jury come to a fair and impartial agreement, saying that the officers were not at fault, that they didn't go way overboard, what their rights are when it comes to deadly force. So explain that again for people just joining us.
Well, again, a big part of this case was expert testimony, and the defense proffered experts that said that this degree of force, manner of force, was reasonable under the circumstances. As we talked about earlier in the first segment, one of the co-defendants, Martin, who had already pled guilty, was many perceived as the primary aggressor. So they were able to point the finger at somebody that wasn't there. So remember, even though they were all there were different levels of culpability in terms of their actions, whether it be not aiding, whether it be obstruction of justice, whether it be tampering with evidence, which was some of the charges people were convicted of in federal court. But it was different actors doing the pepper spraying, doing the kicking, doing the baton, but the whole picture was just incredibly disturbing. So how did it happen? I think what the defense did is they attempted to separate each of their clients. So you had Bean, you had Smith, you had Haley, and you tried to say, you need to focus on the conduct of my particular client at this particular time. But a very, and again, this case isn't over.
No, it's not over. Let's talk about the federal. They've already been convicted. Let's just talk about the sentencing, right?
Right, and under the federal sentencing guidelines, there's a variety of things.
And let's talk about what those convictions are for, because murder is not on the table there.
Right. The convictions in federal court were lesser offenses. They were civil rights charge.
Tampering
right? with evidence and things such as that. One of them, Haley, was acquitted of a significant civil rights violation, which carried up to 10 years. So it's going to be interesting, because in federal court, when you have a federal conviction, then you have the probation office that files a pre-sentence report that you can object, and they can include, even though it's separate from what your client was charged with and did, relevant conduct. And there are different guideline enhancements that can be used to give someone an enhancement to their federal sentence, or there are things that you can do to make it lower, make the elevator go down. So you're going to see those lawyers frantically try to manipulate the federal sentencing guidelines to get an optimum result for their clients. But here's going to be, you can't take the human factor out of any equation. So now the 800-pound gorilla in the room is going to be, these officers walked on a state case. And so you're going to have people that are involved in the federal case, and you're going to have a very different vibe. It's going to be, potentially, somebody needs to be held accountable for what happened here.
They're not off the hook yet, even though these are not murder charges.
They're not off the hook, but they're significantly, legally much better off than where they started, because, like I said, in the federal case, the individuals that did not plead, Bean, Smith, and Haley, were convicted of much lesser federal offenses, acquitted on a lot of the civil rights violations, and again, in the state case, walked, because, second-degree murder under Tennessee law is 15 to 25 years, aggravated assault 3 to 6 years, kidnapping, another C felony, and they could have had decades in prison. So a surprising verdict, but the other thing, I believe the Scorpion unit has been disbanded after this in Memphis. So there has been some positive that's come out of it.
Well, and let me ask you this. So all five, just weeks, if that long, after the indictments came down, and after all this happened, all five were fired from the police department. Since those three were acquitted, I guess it depends on what happens with the federal case, could they ever be officers again? or is this done?
I think very, very unlikely.
Yeah, I think so too.
And again,
but you never know. I mean, I was just wondering what the law says.
yeah, and you never know. So
Yeah.
so you actually have instead of parallel trains with a state prosecution, federal prosecution, you've got 3 trains, and there's a ongoing civil lawsuit that Crump has filed, where
Ben
he
Crump,
is
you know that name.
who tends to parachute in a lot of civil rights cases, does an excellent job, but there is that has become a bare knuckles, publicly fought lawsuit where the lawyers for the city of Memphis filed a motion to hold Crump in contempt yesterday for him talking about the city had, quote, plenty of insurance and that they were not going to be bankrupted by a verdict, which insurance is a no-no when you're talking about cases. But so everybody's not out of the woods yet. So the other thing is now that you've got convictions and you've got acquittals, that takes away the Fifth Amendment privilege, so people can be deposed. The civil lawsuit can now proceed with more haste.
Is this going to drag on, or do you think it will be? I mean, this happened 2 years ago. We just arrived at this point. It's quicker than other cases. How can you tell?
It's much quicker, and I think the city of Memphis and the district attorney's office, law enforcement, should be provided because, a lot of times you have fights, and typically the media will get involved and people wanting transparency and wanting to have the body cameras released. They did this almost immediately.
Yeah.
And they did not wait to bring criminal charges. I think everything, the event happened in January 2023, charges emanated a few weeks later. So, they have done everything they can do. But, at some point, whether it's an acquittal, whether it's a conviction, respect the jury's verdict because they were there. A lot of these armchair quarterbacks did not look at the evidence, did not hear the proof. So, it's not that we need judicial reform because we don't like the result. It's just, as they said at the very beginning of our republic, it's better that one guilty man go free than 100 guilty men go free than one innocent man convicted. And
on that note, let's take another break.
We shall.
And we're going to hear, you were talking about armchair quarterbacks. These people may be a little bit closer to the case than that, but we're going to hear what some of the people are saying who are surrounding this case. We are continuing our conversation and coverage about the Tyre Nichols case and the officers who were acquitted. The 3 were, and then there are 2 others who are in prison now, and this whole thing isn't over yet. We still have the federal convictions, Greg, as we've been talking about. But we want to listen now to some of Nichols' family members and some community members after those verdicts came in.
Yesterday was a devastating blow to our family.
Rain falling like tears from Tyre Nichols' mother, Rovon Wells, speaking from a broken heart. 3 of the former Memphis police officers charged in the death of her son, found not guilty in a state trial on all 21 counts. All 5 officers were found guilty on federal charges and will soon face sentencing.
Everybody keeps talking about the federal charges, but the federal charges don't count. The murder charges are what mattered, and those white people failed us. They failed this entire city.
Demonstrators and family both questioning the Hamilton County-based jury.
What they saw was a black man running from the police.
Say that!
They didn't care that my son was afraid for his life.
How you go to Chattanooga and still find 14 white people?
Reaction poured in from state and city officials after the verdict.
My prayers are with the Nichols family.
But the video statement by Mayor Paul Young and Memphis Police CJ Davis rang hollow with this group.
Mayor Young, if you love Tyre Nichols, you would have got rid of CJ Davis. It's her unit that she brought from Atlanta and created the Scorpion unit right here in Memphis, Tennessee.
All right, some pretty out there reaction from different people, and we had alluded to some of these talks of racism and other aspects of this case, but people are absolutely outraged.
very raw comments, but you know, Lori, a victim's job is to be a victim, and when you lose a loved one in the manner it was here, they have the First Amendment right to express their views. So, you know, God bless them. It was a terrible loss, a terrible tragedy, and you know, let's remember, it doesn't mean that these officers didn't do anything wrong. What it means is that the state of Tennessee did not prove these specific criminal charges: second-degree homicide, official impression, aggravated kidnapping, aggravated assault, official misconduct, beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest standard we have. So again, this verdict doesn't mean that the officers are somehow cleared, somehow acquitted. They just weren't found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So, you know, again, my heart goes out to that family, and victims' job is to be victims. But, you know, the silent majority always in these cases is jurors. And, you know, I have some empathy for the jurors that left their home and their family and did what they thought was right. So, you know, the sad part of it is no one wins in a case like this, even if the officers are acquitted. It's tough. Not only was the video of him being tased, batoned, kicked, beaten, graphic, and it, you know, it really holds no place in law enforcement.
He died of
for
head
a
injuries
for
3
a
days
for a
after.
traffic stop. Whether you're guilty of second-degree murder or not, it does not need to be a policing tactic that we use in the 20th century.
Doesn't it say a lot that Memphis has gotten rid of the Scorpion unit?
I think it speaks volumes.
Me too.
But you know, at the end of the day, we don't know if the system worked, and it's not supposed to come up with. And here's I'll leave you with this:
Almost out of time.
a particular result. The way the system works is everyone needs to work to have a fair trial for both the state, the defendant, the victims, and that's what happened, no matter which side of the courtroom you're on. But at the end of the day, not guilty verdicts is not an endorsement that these officers did the right thing.
We'll keep following this case. All right, Greg,
Let's do it.
thank you. Let's talk more at 5:30.